I've played tons of NES games, and throughout my career on Twitch and YouTube, I've had the luxury of identifying products that are tied to specific companies. After all, the game you play is an extension of their capabilities. It serves as the identity of an era. Now, usually I wouldn't talk about this because I have plans to create a series that talks about all the games ever created by a specific company. It's an offshoot of Conquering Companies, but I've yet to complete a library for a whole company. So, when our Epic community member Doodroid mentioned my top 10 favorite NES developers, it really made me think. So that's the purpose of today's episode, my top 10 favorite NES developers. Let's begin. I know it's probably going to boggle some brains to have Rare on the list, but from face value, Rare was a badass company. For anyone who doesn't know, Rare, prior to becoming Rare, were known as Ultimate Play the Game, and as a company, they had significant importance in the PC gaming industry, creating legacy software for the ZX Spectrum. It was very much culturally relevant in Europe. But when they hopped onto the 8-bit era of gaming, they pushed the NES's hardware to the breaking point. They created custom engines, brilliant artwork, and to me, the games were designed in a clever way. Nintendo themselves are so impressed by the capabilities of Rare to reverse engineer NES hardware that they gave them a license. A license from Nintendo? That was pretty fucking hard to get. That relationship all but saved Donkey Kong as a franchise and led to some incredibly memorable games in the N64 era. Some of their key contributions included RC Pro-Am, an isometric racing game that featured an early iteration of weapon mechanics, Snake Rattle and Roll, a quirky little physics-heavy isometric platformer, and of course, Battletoads, the most infamously difficult beat-em-up you will ever play. Rare as a company, they traumatized an entire generation with their unique and experimental games, usually to the tune of broken controllers and words that would make Jesus cry. But their contributions to the NES era of gaming is one that deserves to be recognized, and while I might not enjoy their early games, they aren't bad. I'm just bad at them. It's funny to think that a Radio Shop would go on to create video games. I guess I shouldn't be surprised though. Coleco, for anyone who's old enough to remember the ColecoVision, was a leather company. That's what Coleco stands for, the Connecticut Leather Company. The more you know, right? But yeah, Hudson started in the early 70s as a radio company and made that jump to video game development, becoming one of the earliest Japanese third-party developers. To me, they were instrumental in defining early NES gameplay sensibilities, like colorful, fast, arcade-inspired, and in many cases, deceptively fucking difficult games. As a company, they didn't mind being different, being weird. Almost all of the games had off-the-wall mechanics that in some way had a strange charm. And they were also known to blend genres, which wasn't something that tended to happen often. Some of their games that stand out are the Adventure Island series, a shitty platformer featuring a guy who puts Crisco on his feet, Bomberman, one of the first games to really set in stone that multiplayer could be chaotic and fun, Milon's Secret Castle, a cult classic maze game, and of course Star Soldier, one of the more difficult shooters on the console. And there are tons of other one-offs and collaborations that showed that Hudson was willing to play ball with anyone who would take the time to give them a chance. Originally known as Tecon, Techmo made its presence known in the mid-80s, specifically 1986, where they broke into the gaming world, carving a niche for games that had cinematic presentation, deep gameplay, and what I would consider fluid and responsive animation for the era. To me, Techmo games, they had swagger, they had presence, and one of the things I love about them is that their games are polished and presentable. To me, they took the standard of storytelling and blew everyone else out of the water. Games at the time mostly consisted of press start, do buffoonery. But Techmo went above and beyond to make sure that you felt like you were really involved in a story. Most of you know Ninja Gaiden, which is a platformer to rule all the platformers, an arcade adaptation with great cutscenes, badass action, and abilities that blew our minds. Let's not forget Tecmo Bowl, which all but wrote the playbook for future console sports games. Other games you might know are Rygar, an action exploration RPG-ish Metroidvania with extra steps, and of course Solomon's Key, a significantly underrated puzzle platformer. You might also know Captain Tsubasa. To my knowledge, it's one of the only sports RPGs that stand out to me. Natsume is a company that is relatively new to me. In fact, if you watch some of my earlier 10 lists, you know that Abadox was my introduction to Natsume. In terms of overall presence in video game history, they showed up around the late 80s, and as a newer company, they didn't flood the market with bullshit. In fact, they worked with well-known publishers like Taito or Bandai to release what I would consider top-tier games on the NES. They were known for giving us epic visuals and controls that were tight, like stupid tight. And what's crazy to me is that in many ways, they defined the late era of the NES. I would argue that many of their games could shine on the Super Nintendo. They understood what made gaming on the NES so much fun. Some of the games you might know are Shatterhand, a late generation masterpiece with one of the most innovative upgrade systems I've seen in a platformer, Shadow of the Ninja, which up until a few months ago I thought was a Ninja Gaiden game, Power Blade, and SCAT, Special Cybernetic Attack Team. It's so crazy to think that for a company that dedicated so much time to action, they kind of mellowed out in their later years. After all, they did develop Harvest Moon. To be involved in the video game industry as a developer is a constant chess match with your opponents to do something that A, they haven't done, or B, what they have done and do it better. If I walked up to you and said, hey, in your opinion, what's the most well-known company-based feud in video game history, you'll likely say Nintendo versus Sega. After all, that was the console war. But if you walked up to me and asked me the same, I might say Square and Enix. Way back in the early years of the NES, Square was a small company. They were trying to find their footing, and they did so with a very diverse portfolio of games. The one that stood out, obviously, the most successful was Final Fantasy, the game that saved Square from bankruptcy, and a direct answer to Enix's Dragon Quest line. They did make other games like Rad Racer, King's Knight, and the 3D Battles of World Runner, of which I'm not a fan of, but I have nothing but the utmost respect for a company sticking their neck out and providing us not only with the framework of a solid JRPG, but also gracing us with the abilities of Nazir Gabelli, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and Nobuo Uematsu. At number 5, we have the problem children of the gaming industry. First generation Atari was sued by Magnavox, which created the precedent for hardware-based patents. Second generation, they were sue happy against Activision, and that led to the third-party developer system. And in the third generation, they were the agitators. Nintendo was really strict about the quality of games that were being produced. Allegedly. We all know that some of the worst games on the NES have a seal of quality. That's just how it is. It all boiled down to money, and Nintendo as a company was really hard set on making sure that they had creative control over pretty much everything. The shipping, exclusivity rights, and ultimately they limited how many games a company could release in one fiscal year. To get around this, a few companies created shadow companies. Konami actually had 2, Ultra Games and Palcom. But Atari had Tingen. Now, you probably already know where this is going, but Tingen led the charge for unlicensed NES games. They actually did it by reverse engineering the tin NES chip. So you'll see those black cartridges a mile away, and some of the games you might know are Tingen Tetris, an extremely rare game. Gauntlet, a dungeon-crawling chaotic couch co-op. RBI Baseball, which is one of their more popular games due to licensing with the MLBPA, and a plethora of arcade ports of Atari games like Rampart, Rolling Thunder, Klax, Tubin. If they could make it, they would. Atlus is a company that thrives on the concept of making you feel uncomfortable. I won't lie to you, that was their shtick. Quirky gameplay with severe atmospheric discomfort, and that kind of stuck in their later years as well, when the Shin Megami Tensei line would come into relevance. Historically, they were just contract developers, right? You slid them a $5 bill, they would do it. And they were so good at flying under the radar. They were strange, challenging, and occasionally annoying as fuck. And what's crazy is that if you've played their game, you remember it, even though you might not know they made it. For example, Rockin' Cats, a criminally underrated platformer with a punch gun mechanic, rich level variety, and slapstick cartoon stylization, or Friday the 13th. Yeah, that skull-fuckingly difficult and annoying LJN gem that people love to hate. Zexus with Hudson. They helped co-develop it. I personally like Wacky Races, a licensed platformer that was actually pretty good. To me, they were the mad scientists of the NES era, and I'm okay with that. Capcom, to me, is retro gaming royalty. From the beginning, they hit the ground running by making some of the greatest arcade games. To me, they're one of the big 8 that you hear me talk about quite often, a group of arcade giants that defined arcade gameplay. Companies like Atari, Sega, Taito, Nintendo, Namco, Konami, Data East, and Capcom. While they were so badass in the arcades, Capcom did a phenomenal job of porting their games at home when they weren't asking Micronix to do it at least. To me, playing a Capcom-developed game meant that I knew that there would be bright, appealing visuals, responsive controls, and a difficulty that was unmistakable but approachable. Games like Mega Man 1 through 6, the golden standard of 8-bit platforming, DuckTales, which was based on the Mega Man engine, and to be honest, one of the best licensed games ever. Who can forget Chip and Dale, Bionic Commando, or even Little Nemo, the Dream Master? Capcom treated the NES as a platform to grow on, and they understood what their consumer wanted. Their licensed games didn't suck. It made LJN look like child's play. The Godfathers, the gatekeepers, the builder of the house, Nintendo. I know it might be weird not to give them number 1, but hear me out. Nintendo didn't just develop games for the NES, they were the NES. They defined what an 8-bit game should look like, sound like, and feel like. They crafted icons, legacy franchises that our fathers played, we played, and God willing, our children and grandchildren will as well. From hardware to software to licensing, if you have a game on your shelf, someone at Nintendo had a fingerprint in it, period dot. Their franchises stood out. They were the salvation after the video game crash of the second generation. Mario was fine-tuned. Zelda provided an open-world adventure long before the term ever existed, and Metroid? Samus's reveal was the biggest mindfuck of the decade. And their other games, they weren't bad either. Balloon Fight, Ice Climber, Kid Icarus, well, fuck that one, but the other ones aren't that bad. And the principles of the game design and their philosophy is still felt to this day. And some of those philosophical standards are very outdated, and I feel that Nintendo will be a catalyst to the downfall of modern gaming, but what do I know? I'm just a boy. There were so many companies that kicked ass on the NES. It was hard to pick 10 great novelty games, great music, a solid library of memories that we can go up and pop in and return to a time where our only obligation was going to school and coming home. But one company stood out, Konami. Konami wasn't just great on the NES, they dominated it. They didn't limit themselves to a mascot, a formula, a genre. They did everything: platformers, shooters, sports games, action RPGs. And while I feel Nintendo set the rules, Konami bent those rules into an art. The later Konami games seemed to play as if Konami was telling Nintendo, we've mastered your platform, what's next? The games they developed were edgy. You played Capcom games for polish and a good time, you played Techmo games to test your abilities, and you played Konami games to get your ass kicked. They were fearless in execution and ability, they were bold, they were brave, and in my opinion, I adore their music. You can tell a Konami soundtrack a mile away. Castlevania to me will always be the franchise I think of with Konami, a powerful platformer with technical prowess, especially the third. Metal Gear gave us stealth in a game that was unheard of. What about Contra? The introduction of the most infamous cheat code known to mankind, or Gradius and Life Force, the exemplar of what a horizontal shooter could be. And let's not forget Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That license was in good hands with Konami. And there you have it, my top 10 NES developers. These were the studios that didn't just make the games, they built worlds, forged legends, and turned childhood afternoons into unforgettable adventures. Whether you were dodging flying fists and Battletoads, pogo jumping on the moon with Scrooge McDuck, or praying to the cartridge gods for a miracle in Castlevania, these developers shaped what it meant to play a game in the 8-bit era. Did I miss one of your favorites? Did I snub Sunsoft, forget Jaleco, or maybe even trigger your LJN PTSD? Let me know your picks down in the comment section below. Who knows, maybe you'll share a common idea with another community member. Speaking of our community, if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home with us. We're a gathering of video game enthusiasts that love to remember when life was just a little bit easier to live, and if you align with that, you'll fit right in. Finally, the single most important thing you could do for me is hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.